Good afternoon, everybody. Truth Seeker again, and I am presenting what I hope will be interesting material. I did a word study, a word count in the Watchtower magazines going back from 1870s to the present. In one of my recent videos, and one of my viewers thought that was an interesting idea and made a suggestion regarding when did Jesus take a back seat, and she suggested doing a similar word study. So I thought she had a pretty good point. And so I did that, and I also did a word count on the name Abraham. Now, recently, Lloyd Evans did a critique on a convention talk for the Jehovah's Witness summer convention. I guess he was focusing on the frequency with which the Watchtower referred to Abraham as an example, and talked about their obsession with Abraham. And so I thought that would be an interesting word study to take a look at the frequency with which the word or term Abraham manifested itself within the pages of the Watchtower through its 140-year history. And so I plotted these things out on a time series, and also I did another plot on a phrase, New World Society. Now, that was something that is kind of interesting because the frequency with which it was used for a period of time in Watchtower's history begs the question, what happened to the New World Society? And so that turned out to be something that I thought was interesting. So why don't we just get to these plots so that we don't spend a lot of time talking. I want to try and keep this video within some reasonable period of time. Now, this first plot that you see is the ratio of the name Jehovah to Jesus, and how many times the name Jehovah appeared in a given year of the Watchtower versus the name Jesus. And this was done upon the recommendation of one of my viewers who wanted to know, or thought it would be interesting to see, when the Jehovah's Witnesses, or when Watchtower kind of put let's say a premium on Jehovah and Jesus taking a back seat to Jehovah. And you could see in the early years, 1875, 1879 to about 1915, during Russell's era, the ratio was relatively small. Now, I plotted this on a log scale so that the points and the pattern, whatever patterns there may be, would show up more distinctly. And you could see here that the ratio of Jehovah to Jesus is smaller. He referred to Jesus more frequently than he did to Jehovah. And that's probably because he referred to Jehovah more in terms of the name God or the title. I guess God is more of a title than a name. Jehovah is the name. But you can see here that that with relationship to one another, Jehovah, the use of Jehovah was much smaller than the use of Jesus in the Watchtower during Russell's era. And when Russell passed in 1916, Joseph Rutherford took over as the president, and you can see almost an instant increase in the frequency with which the name Jehovah is used. And by the mid to late 1920s, the use of Jehovah was about the same as the frequency with which the name Jesus appeared. So that ratio was roughly 1. And by 1931, you could see that actually it exceeded 1. That the times the name Jehovah is referred to with relative to that of Jesus was far more frequent. Probably in the 2 to 3 times range. I didn't actually put labels on those, so it would have probably been a good idea. Again, this is a log scale, so let's see, it's probably about 2, factor of 2 times that of the frequency of Jesus. But as you can see, from 1931 onward, there's been a gradual increase in the frequency of the use of the name Jehovah with relative to the name Jesus. And it's also during that same period the Watchtower became far more autocratic. And that is due to its concept of a top-down organization, that the Watchtower represents God's organization on earth, and that God rules as a theocracy. And so it's a very autocratic idea that the Watchtower is promoting in terms of its control over not only its members, but eventually over the whole world. When God sets up his kingdom, he sets it up as a theocracy. So I thought this was a pretty interesting graphic. You can see basically when the Bible Students movement became Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's during that transition period that I highlighted there between 1915 and 1931. I darkened the background in that period. I called the transition period. Even though the movement still referred to themselves as Bible students, the leadership had taken a distinct made a distinct change in its focus, and that focus being more on Jehovah, and increasingly so as time progresses. So in current watchtowers, you'll find the name Jehovah far more frequently than you will find the name Jesus. They don't really put much emphasis on Jesus as they once did. And Jesus really had a very important part in witness and Bible student theology in the early years because of the emphasis on the doctrine of the ransom. In recent years, in recent decades really, the ransom has been downplayed. This next graph that we're going to take a look at, I think, is also interesting. It has to do with the memorial. Now, getting memorial data was a little bit more difficult in the early years because the society was not as statistically oriented or statistically driven as it is in current years. Actually, since the 1930s, that was when Judge Rutherford began issuing annual reports, like a corporation issues annual reports of its activities and its work, and the Watchtower began doing the same sort of thing by issuing, starting in 1927, they began issuing an annual report on its efforts for the previous year. The blue curve that you see here are those figures for memorial attendance, and the orange curve are those data for memorial partaking. And I plotted them on the same, over one another on the same graphic, but on two different scales. The blue is plotted on the left-hand scale, which is a logarithmic scale, because over time the number of people attending memorial was far greater than the number that partook of the memorial. So that overwhelming number wouldn't make too much of a sense to make an overplot, because the orange points would look like they're down on the x-axis, so it wouldn't show up. So I plotted the orange points on a different scale, which is shown on the right. Now, as you can see, in the early years, the numbers were a little less, let's say, accurate. They were partial reports, but that's all we had to go by, were the partial reports for memorial attendance numbers that were reported in the watchtowers themselves. Usually in the last month of the year, the December issue provided what they called a service report, and a number of those later watchtowers provided memorial attendance numbers, and you could see that they were going up. They reached about 90,000 in the mid-1920s, but then between 1927 and 1928 there was a precipitous drop, and that shows on this curve as almost a step jump down, and it went from roughly 90,000, or actually a little under 90,000 memorial attendance, to under 18,000 in attendance. I think it was 17,380 was the figure for 1928's memorial attendance. And that was found in Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Purpose. You could find that number. There's some memorial attendance figures in that book. And that seems to be the first history book issued or published by the Watchtower Society, and it has some interesting data. Also, I noticed that that book, Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Purpose, also refers to Charles Taze Russell some 400 times, or almost 400 times in the book, which is interesting because in later histories that they issued, such as the the 1993 history. What I have a senior moment right now, but the history that I'm talking about. God, it'll come to me in a minute. They have chapters referencing Russell, but the emphasis on Russell isn't very not nearly as frequent as in its first history. The Proclaimers book. That's the book I'm talking about. 1993 Proclaimers book. It does provide an early history, but it doesn't nearly go into the kind of detail that the Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Providence, which was published in 1959. In fact, there's no mention of Nelson Barber in the Proclaimers book, whereas Barber is mentioned in the Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Providence book, which is interesting. Because if you happen to go to the headquarters, Watchtower headquarters at Warwick, there's a little museum there, and at the entrance of the museum, there's a display that mentions a placard that mentions the people that influenced Russell during the 19th century, like Henry Grew, George Stetson, and George Storrs, individuals like that, Jonas Wendell. They're mentioned and shown pictorially on this the wall of the entrance to the museum, and Barber is not shown; he is omitted. So Barber has really disappeared from Jehovah's Witness history. But what's interesting about this, aside from the fact that you see almost a perfect curve from 1931 to the present time, 2020. That curve is almost too good to be true. It's just amazing to see how smooth that curve is, which gives you makes the data somewhat suspect to me, except for the fact that the orange curve, which shows not only the memorial attendance, which the blue curve shows, but the orange curve shows the partakers. And you could see that there was a precipitous drop in the number of partakers from in the 30s. In the 1930s, I think 36,000 was the largest number that I found of partakers during the 1930s. I think it was around 1935 or 36. It dropped in very rapidly through the 30s into the 40s, and continuing in decline all the way until about 2005. And then this curve takes a sharp increase, which is interesting because the Watchtower teaching on the individuals that are going to be part or make up the 144,000, they're called the remnant. And this remnant should decline until it disappears. And there really isn't any expectation for this remnant who expect to be part of the 144,000 to increase. But since 2005, there's been a very sharp increase in the number of individuals who believe that they are going to make up the 144,000. and that number is over 20,000 currently. So it's interesting to see that phenomena and why, especially since Rutherford and those that followed Rutherford in the leadership role identified 1935 as the date at which no new members of the heavenly class, or the 144,000, can have, let's say, the opportunity of being part of that heavenly class. I think as time went on, they had to reverse that teaching, and I think that was reflected in this 2005, that increase starting around 2005. And so there are quite a few. There's, I think it dropped to about 8,000 in 2005. And so there's been more than a doubling in the number of individuals who partake of the memorial, although the ratio is still very small. I mean, it's a rare event for anybody to see a Jehovah's Witness partake of the emblems at a memorial. So, back in the early days during Russell's time and the early part of Rutherford's presidency, the majority of those associated with Watchtower believed, the overwhelming majority associated with Watchtower believed that they were going to be part of the 144,000. And that ratio has dropped significantly, even though we do see an increase in the number of people partaking of the memorial. It'll be interesting to see how that goes in the future, because the longer Armageddon is put off, the more they're going to have to deal with this problematic idea. You know, if you take the 144,000 number literally and spread it out over the 2,000 years since Christ died, it comes to about 70 people a year. And that number, the more that time passes, the number of those that God would select per year would be on the decline. Right now, I think it's if you take the current date, 2021, and subtract 30 AD, and that 1900 some odd years, and you divide 144,000 by almost 2,000 years, it comes down to less than 80 people per year, and that's not a lot of people. So who knows? Maybe they'll make a change in the doctrine that's a figurative number as opposed to a literal number, and that would solve a lot of problems for Watchtower. But for the last 150 or 140 some odd years of Watchtower's existence, the memorial, not the memorial, but the high calling, or the heavenly class, has been taken literally to be 144,000. That seventh chapter of Revelation, where it talks about the 144,000, and that's always been interpreted in a literal way. Now, the next curve. Now, this next curve I thought was pretty interesting. Lloyd, as I mentioned at the opening of this video, Lloyd Evans made a video on the convention where he pointed out this obsession with Abraham. And during the convention, apparently there were 5 talks in which Abraham was featured as being the ideal model of faithfulness. And I thought about this because all my life growing up in the Bible students, and much of what the Bible students and the Jehovah's Witnesses believe are very much the same. There are differences, I would say between 80 and 90% of Bible students' beliefs are the same or similar to Watchtower beliefs, and I think this obsession with Abraham has been one that is common to both sects, both sects that were associated with the Watchtower Society. And as you can see here, there is no real distinct pattern, except that over time there tended to be an increase in the frequency with which Abraham was referenced or identified in the pages of the Watchtower. Again, this is a word count. The blue dots are the actual word counts for each given year of the Watchtower. So every dot represents the number of times the word Abraham appears in a given year's Watchtower. So there are some 100 some odd points here represented. I took a rolling average, a 6-year rolling average, to smooth out the curve a little bit, to show trending a little better. And you can see that between 1879 and 1905, thereabouts, this again is, I adjusted this, like in epidemiology, they use like death rates, and the death rate will be 8 people per 100,000. I did the same for the word count Abraham, and I used 1,000 pages as the reference point. So this is a word count. The scale on the left is 0 to 900 times that the word Abraham would appear per 1,000 pages. And so it's the same idea. And the orange curve is the like I said, the rolling average, which kind of smooths out the data so that you get a better idea of the pattern that exists within the if there is any pattern that exists within the scatter. There's a lot of scatter, a lot of variability in the data, in the blue dots, as you can see. There was an increase in 1905, and you can notice that in 1907, Russell went out on a limb and made a doctrinal change, a pronounced doctrinal change that he was concerned about fragmenting the membership of the society. And it did, to a certain extent. Not as bad as he had expected it would be, but it did occur. In fact, individuals like Ernest Hennings, people who were prominent in the Watchtower in the early years of the Watchtower, like Ernest Hennings, and there were others. I can't pull them out on the tip of my tongue right now, but Hennings is one that I know of because he married Rose Ball, the infamous Rose Ball, who became the focal point, the controversial focal point in the antagonistic divorce between Maria Russell and Charles. And so Hennings became disfellowshipped from the Watchtower Society. He was the branch manager of the Australian branch in Melbourne, and the society cut ties with him. Russell in particular cut ties with him, despite the fact that Hennings was married to Rose Ball, his alleged or quote-unquote stepdaughter or adopted daughter, foster daughter, I guess they called her, even though she was 16 when she came under the care of the Russells. So you see a pretty sharp increase in referencing to Abraham just after 1905, and that was because of this doctrinal change. There was an article, I believe, in the 1907, one of the watchtowers in 1907 called The Three Great Covenants, and Russell made it clear that he believed the church was not developed under the New Covenant, which was something that he had taught for the previous 20, 30 years of his ministry. And that caused quite a stir within the movement, but it didn't fragment the movement nearly as badly as Russell thought it would. And that became the official doctrine, and Russell made frequent reference to Abraham from that point on. You could see that there was a substantial increase during the period between 1907 and Russell's death in 1916. And from 1916 to 1941 or 42, Rutherford died in very early 1942. Rutherford referred to Abraham very frequently. You could see here that he had quite the obsession with Abraham. So the society always had this thing for Abraham. After Rutherford passed away, you could still see that there was a high frequency of referring to Abraham until about the mid-1950s, and then it dropped off pretty steeply. And it's been pretty steady since that period, from 1955 on to the present. There are small periods where he's mentioned a little more frequently than other periods, but for the most part, Abraham is referred to about the same as during the period of Russell. And so this thing that the Watchtower has had with Abraham is this obsession with Abraham from the very start. And Abraham, and I think the reason for that is that Abraham was really used by the Watchtower, at least in its early days, as a type or picture, analogy of the whole plan of salvation. The idea that in thee and thy seed shall all nations be blessed is a teaching, is a promise that was made to Abraham in the scriptures in Genesis, that the Bible students always used in referring to the kingdom, to the time of blessing when righteousness would be poured out upon all of humanity, and everyone would live under righteous conditions. Everyone would be blessed and living in a utopian type society. And this promise that was made to Abraham that his seed would be blessed was always used by the Bible students and the Watchtower to refer to as sort of an attractive a point of doctrine that would attract individuals looking forward to the golden age, always looking forward to a better time. And so I think that is one of the key reasons for this, as also the picture of sacrifice. Not only was Abraham, who represented God in the picture, sacrificing his son on behalf of humanity to make sure that this blessing would come upon humanity, but also the faithfulness of Isaac himself, who laid down his life willingly to make this promise possible. And so it was an example of faith on both Abraham and Isaac's part, and used extensively as a lesson for the degree to which individuals should consecrate themselves or give up their lives in the cause, in God's cause, and making a sacrifice unto death. That there was nothing less expected. You were to give up everything for getting the blessing of Abraham. So it's no wonder that Watchtower likes Abraham, likes to use Abraham as a lesson of faith, because of the degree to which both Abraham and Isaac were willing to go to give up their very lives in faith, in service to God. And not only that, they had to circumcise Isaac, and Abraham circumcised themselves as let's say a seal on the covenant that they made with God, that in thee shall all nations be blessed. So it's a pretty harsh means of verifying or confirming the covenant, but that's the degree to which the Watchtower expects its individuals to give their lives in service to God. And it's not only Watchtower. The Bible students have the same expectations. When an individual in the Bible students is baptized, they've given up their life rights to have a resurrection in the kingdom, to be part of the 144,000. Bible students believe that they are all part of the 144,000 if they are faithful unto death. And if they're not, then they're in jeopardy of the second death, which means that you have no opportunity for a resurrection, because when you've baptized, you've given up your right to having a resurrection through the ransom. So it's a pretty severe expectation on the part of both Jehovah's Witnesses and Watchtower when you baptize and dedicate yourself, consecrate yourself to God's service. Now, here's something that I thought was pretty fascinating. The Bible that the Jehovah's Witnesses use is called the New World Translation. I'm not telling anybody anything new. You're all Jehovah's Witnesses. The majority of you that follow my channel. I was raised a Bible student. We did not use the New World Translation just because it came out of the Watchtower. That was the only reason. It wasn't because Bible students believed it to be an error or that it was a poor translation. It was just the animosity that the Bible students held against Watchtower for having turned their back on Russell and Russell's teachings, that they had changed anything of Russell, made Watchtower, in the minds of Bible students, come under the influence of Satan. They believed that Satan was responsible for the doctrinal changes and that came to be in the Watchtower Society, and that they're in outer darkness with the rest of the world. In fact, they were virgins at one point whose oil went out of the lamp, and vice versa. That's the way Watchtower described the Bible students in early days. They called the Bible students the evil servant or creature worship, because they were worshiping Russell and not the truth, and that the society was the channel of truth, and that new light was being issued by and through the Watchtower, and the Bible students were holding on to the teachings of Russell, which were outdated. Again, the Watchtower Society has always promoted the idea that the light is increasing, and that as time progresses, there is a more accurate understanding of the Bible as time goes along. Now, sometime during the 1940s, a phenomena occurred within the society. Neither Russell nor Rutherford referred to the Jehovah's Witnesses or the members of the Watchtower Society, those that associated with the Watchtower Society, whether they be Bible student or Jehovah's Witness. They did not refer to them as the New World Society. That term, that phrase, was something that was born in the early 1950s, the late 40s and early 1950s. Now, it came out of the idea of theocracy. Now, Russell believed in a theocracy. He believed that the kingdom was a theocracy, that God was the ultimate power, and the kingdom would be ruled by the king he put in place, which was Jesus, and Jesus would have his co-rulers, his associates, which would be the 144,000, and they would be the kings and priests that ruled with Jesus during the 1,000 years. But even though it was a new heavens and a new earth, Russell never referred to the society as a new world society. And neither did Rutherford, although Rutherford did promote the idea of a theocracy, and that the theocracy was the Watchtower Society, that it was God's agency on earth, and it was through the Watchtower Society that God channeled His truth to the members of the society. So it was a theocratic arrangement, and He reorganized and restructured the movement according to a theocracy idea. But the term New World Society was not something that Rutherford derived or originated. This term occurred in the 1950s, and there's an article in the Watchtower in 1950 that is kind of interesting to read. Now, this is the article that I'm referring to, and you can find it on jw.org. It was the Watchtower, 1950, pages 413, beginning the New World Society. And this is really a description of what this New World Society was. And the Watchtower really promoted this idea of the New World Society. They acknowledged the idea that over the years there was there were different periods of the Watchtower's history, and that the early period was really dealing more focused with the high calling. And it states here, the people for Jehovah's name, whom he has called with the high calling to the heavenly kingdom, and whom He has taken out from all nations by the agency of the new covenant, are now about complete. Only a small remnant of them are yet on earth. They didn't expect that this remnant would grow, as we saw in the memorial chart that I presented earlier. They thought that it would fade away, and then after the last members of the church were taken home to heaven, Armageddon would come, and God would sweep away all vestiges of the old world, evil world under Satan, and set up a new society, a new heavens and a new earth, with the Watchtower at the helm, the Watchtower being the agency through which God's blessings to the world would come. And that's what this article describes, and establishes what this New World Society is, and provides a more definitive idea of the Watchtower's role in God's overall plans or intent. And so it's an interesting article to read. It talks about the year 1935. It says, before the year 1935, we never envisaged this great crowd or have consecrated other sheep. Now, this is interesting because none of the Bible students that associated with the Watchtower and were consecrated and baptized were being baptized for an earthly resurrection. They were baptizing themselves to be part of the 144,000, and this acknowledges that fact. But that there was a revelation, some new light that opened up in the mid-1930s that revealed that there was a great crowd of other sheep. And it describes what of them, we now ask. And then it justifies, even though Russell never had this idea of a New World Society, it says, it uses Russell to justify this whole idea. And it says back in 1904, the first president of the Watchtower Society, they're referring to Russell, although technically he was the second president of the society. William Conway was the Conway was the first president, but only for several years. Russell was de facto the leader from the very beginning. It says he wrote the studies in the scripture called The New Creation. If you've ever seen this book, it's the thickest and most detailed of any of the 6 volumes of the Studies in the Scripture series. It's some 700, 800 pages long, and it basically delineates all of the expectations of those who consecrate themselves to God. What are those expectations behaviorally? And Russell goes into great detail as to what a consecrated life, living a consecrated life, what it means. And it says so here that they reference something out of the new creation. And we may be sure that any consecrating and performing of a full sacrifice of themselves in the interests of the Lord's cause after the heavenly class is complete will find that the Lord has plenty of blessings of some other kind still to give, and that all of his blessings are for such consecrators, self-sacrificers. Possibly they may be counted in with the ancient worthies who had the sacrificing disposition that is pleasing to God. And so this is what the idea was, that those that were coming into the society now were part of the great company or the great crowd, and that they were these individuals who may be counted in with the ancient worthies. The ancient worthies, according to Bible students, were Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Enoch, Noah, and all of the faithful ones identified in Hebrews 11 as being examples, a great cloud of witnesses. And those would have, according to Russell, a part in ruling God's kingdom. They would be God's agents on earth, through whom God would rule in the 1,000-year kingdom. And what they're saying here is that when the door is shut for the heavenly class, Russell thought that there may be others that might consecrate themselves who will miss the high calling, who will come after the 144,000. And if so, there would be maybe some provision on the part of God to count them in with the ancient worthies, to have a part in being an earthly agent representing God's government in the 1,000-year kingdom. And then it goes on to say, years after that publication, the Watchtower had this to say in the September 15th issue, in paragraphs 5, 6 of the article, The Harvest Work. It is our thought that the closing of the door of this gospel age, there will be no more begetting of the Holy Spirit to the spirit nature, i.e. the 144,000. Any afterward coming to God through consecration before the inauguration of the restitution work will be accepted by him, not to the spirit plane of being, but to the earthly plane. Such would come in under the same conditions as the ancient worthies who were accepted of God. The ancient worthies came in, no calling being open to them, the high calling not being yet open. And so it talks about that's what this great crowd is. That was years before members of this great crowd or other sheep began to flock to the side of the spiritual remnant. And so this is what this New World Society was about. And if you look at the chart that we created, you could see that they were really high and mighty on this idea of a New World Society until the mid-1960s. And now the only reference that you see to this New World Society has dropped off to almost nothing. When you do a word count on New World, it's really referring to, in almost every case, referring to the New World Translation. And the New World Translation was named such because it was first issued during this time when this idea of the New World Society was first being promoted in the early 1950s. So this is an interesting aspect of the Watchtower's history, and one that kind of came and passed without a whole lot of notoriety or notice. It just kind of faded away. And you don't see the governing body today talking about the New World Society. Every so often an article will reference this period of time and the New World Society, but there is nothing, there are no articles that are dedicated to the concept or the idea of this New World Society and them being co-rulers with the ancient worthies. I think, you got to remember that during this time, in the 1950s, the membership of the society was still in the hundreds of thousands. It didn't exceed 1 million until around 1960, a little after 1960. And then the Watchtower continued to grow into its current size of about 8.5 million individuals. And I think the leaders of the Watchtower have pretty much scrapped this idea that even scrapping the idea that the ancient worthies have some special role in the new earth, in the new society, that the Watchtower will be God's representatives on earth, and those that are part of that organization will be administrating that new order. But I think that they've given up on this idea of a New World Society that's going to be governed and headed by such individuals as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and other individuals who were considered to be faithful to God, Solomon, Hezekiah, and other such individuals. Because I don't think even back in the 1950s that those who were leading the Watchtower work ever envisioned that membership, that the publishers, the numbers of publishers would ever approach the size that they've approached today. I think it's about 8.5 million. It's not inconceivable that there will be as many as 10 million publishers at some point in time. Although it appears that there is a leveling off, a little slowing down in the number of individuals that are becoming publishers, and that can be directly attributed to the advocacy work that's being done on social media against Watchtower. I think that has a significant impact on the growth of the society, and I think the society is beginning to run into some trouble with regard to the activism against it. So this is something that I think I'm going to look a little bit more into, but I find it fascinating that they were gun-ho on this whole idea of a new world society, this concept, and it dominated about 2 decades worth of Jehovah's Witness activity and work, especially from the leadership side in promoting the society as being a new world society, and how quickly it fell off the radar. It just is almost completely off. Like I point out here, if you do a word search on New World, it's referring to New World Translation. So those little orange points to the right in the year 2000, 2010, and so on, those are references to the New World Translation. And that's something that's mentioned in every Watchtower. That is, if you look in the Watchtower itself, it always refers to the New World Translation, and that's where these numbers arise. But back in the 1950s and early to middle 60s, you could see they were pretty big on this whole idea of the New World Society. So anyway, I thought that was something interesting, and that if anybody has some ideas on that, I'd be interested in hearing about it. I'm not being a Jehovah's Witness and not having lived during that period, I'm not as familiar with the internal workings and why they may have promoted this, and why especially they would have stopped promoting this idea. And there's just one last thing I want to touch on. Now, having plowed through 140 years worth of Watchtowers, this one stood out. And the reason it stood out is I can recall listening to a number of Lloyd Evans broadcasts or discussions where he mentioned that the role of the governing body, that the profile of the governing body has changed dramatically from the time when he was an active witness. He said back in those days, when he was still an active witness, hardly anybody knew who the governing bodies were, governing body members were. They kept such a low profile. They didn't have themselves photographed. They kept out of the limelight. They really kept a low public profile. But with the advent of the JW Broadcasting, it seems as if the tables have turned completely with the governing body, and that they've become publicity hounds. They're seeking every opportunity they can to make themselves visible and seen by the whole body of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I saw this particular issue, which is the January 1st, 1998 Watchtower, and the face looked familiar to me. Now, given that very few people would have known who the governing body were just by their looks. I think that this would have been just any guy. The truth transforms lives, and there's a guy in the gutter down there, but now presumably this man, after finding Jehovah and Jehovah's Witnesses, became this upstanding man, and they used this image. Well, it looked an awful lot like Gerrit Loesch to me. Now, Gerrit Loesch was made a governing body member in 1994. He's currently the longest standing governing body member, and he must be in his 80s at this point, and he certainly has aged quite a bit. I mean, 1994 is some 30 years ago now, and almost 30 years at least. And you certainly, the photograph has been touched up so to make the individual look upright and healthy and transformed, especially compared to the guy in the gutter, who looks a little like Lloyd Evans. But anyway, this is a 1998 issue, so it couldn't have been. But regardless, is this a spoof? Because they knew nobody would know who this guy is, a new governing body member. Let's use him. I don't know, but here's a photograph of a young Gerrit Loesch. Now you tell me, am I seeing things, or is that image or photograph used on that 1998 Watchtower Gerrit Loesch? Now, I did a search for information on the cover within the Watchtower, and there's nothing at all that describes the cover. Like National Geographic, they'll have some info inside the National Geographic about the cover photo. There's nothing inside the Watchtower about the cover photo. But I swear to God, that's got to be Gerrit Loesch. Maybe I'm seeing things, but to me, that looks like Gerrit Loesch. So I'm sure I'll see something in the comments, but I can't help it. I think they used Gerrit Loesch, and they did it on purpose because they knew that the governing body members were just not that well known. They kept a low profile. Nobody would know who this guy is. And at that time, he would have been, if not the newest, among the newest governing body members. And I think he's about the right age. You got to remember, this is a touched-up photo. But that young Gerrit Loesch photo looks very much the same as this one. So that did take a little longer than I anticipated. I really did try to keep it short, brief, but anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and I would be interested in your comments, and if you have anything else that you'd be interested in doing some kind of a statistical search or something that you would suggest, I'm amenable to it if I have the time. Some of these do take quite a bit of time because there are 140 years worth of watchtowers. So anyway, I hope you found this interesting. I enjoy doing these kinds of analyses. It gives me a better picture of the society, and the society is what shaped the Bible students. I mean, come on. The Bible students are not much different. I mean, if you really stop and you take a look at the Bible students' culture, the belief system, the everything that makes up the Bible students as a movement is very much similar to the Watchtower Society. I think it's a little less autocratic, but not much, not really. You pay a price if you go against the culture. There is disfellowshipping and there is ostracizing in the Bible students. It occurs. So anyway, I wish you all well and take care.